Finance's webinar hosted by InnovateX. We are so excited to have you here and thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Everyone, so I'm going to quickly talk about what InnovateX is. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that aspires to increase accessibility to personal finance and entrepreneur opportunities for students of all socioeconomic backgrounds. And we do things like advocacy work, host submission programs, workshops, and provide access to various resources. So yeah, there's many ways to reach us. You could email us, you can DM us on Instagram, and there's a lot of other different ways. And that's me. I'm co-hosting with Vivian.
Hi. And we are so excited to present our guest speaker, Jack Wang. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Vivian. And thank you to everyone connected with InnovateX and all of you here in the audience tonight. My name is Jack Wang. I'm a college aid advisor. I'm actually based in the greater Boston area. And I've been where you are. In fact, I'm going through it again. So I have two sons who have since graduated college. My younger son graduated from University of Massachusetts in May of 2020, the height of the pandemic. My older son graduated Temple University prior to that. But now I also have a stepdaughter who is a high school senior. She just started her senior year. So we're going through this whole process again. So I'm here, I want to share a lot of information with you and make it useful. So if you have questions as you go along, please use the chat button, which is at the bottom of your screen, to type in your questions. Daniel and Vivian will keep an eye on that chat. And at the end, you're going to also get my email. So if there's any questions that we weren't able to get to, or you just had other questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share, happy to help. Okay. So with that, let me go ahead and oops. I'm going to share my screen here. And all right, it's just coming up. Okay, and I apologize. I have to. The PowerPoint was being a little bit goofy, and I'm not going to show you every slide. We'll be here all night, but we'll get the basic gist. So we're going to talk about how financial aid works. And for those of you who are, obviously high school students, or if there's any parents in the audience, is probably a big question and a big concern. But I'm going to tell you right now, what I'm going to tell you is probably going to be a little bit different than what you normally hear. But it's really how it works. So we're going to just briefly cover things like key questions and considerations, the types of aid. We're going to specifically talk about merit aid, which is scholarships, and need-based aid. And I'm going to show you some real situations of what aid looks like in real life, and then some strategies. Now, just so you're aware, okay, oftentimes people ask, well, what about should we just focus on the emission stuff and then we'll worry about financial aid later? Believe it or not, the two are very, very intertwined, right? So what you're doing right now, high school seniors and high school senior parents, what you're doing on your application stuff and what the schools you're applying to has a huge impact on how much aid you're going to get. And so for those of you who are younger, juniors, sophomores, or even freshmen, you're hearing this in advance, and so you can plan accordingly. All right, so let's talk a little about an overview. The hard part about a college is there's all these different prices. So this is actually Boston University. It's not the picture, but the prices are. So depending on the students, some kids pay as low as $12,900 last year, freshman class, okay? But other students, in fact, over half of the freshman class last year paid the full sticker price of $79,606. Okay. Now, if you can afford that, that's great. not, I don't know a ton of people who are willing to write a check, pay $79,606 willingly. So, because everybody pays something different, and this is pretty much true at all colleges, like why do some people pay less and why do some people pay more? And so that's what we're going to talk about. Okay. So the two key questions, and so I'm going to start with this. And so really we're going to focus on the one on the left, and that is how to lower the cost of college. In other words, how to get more aid, right? There's a whole second section I typically work with parents on is actually once the bill comes, how do you actually pay it, right? What strategies there are, but really tonight we're going to focus on the left. And so if you think about this, especially if you're a senior or you're going through this college search process, chances are you're asking, or your parents are asking this question: what colleges will accept me, right? Or where can I get in? And so if you think about that question and all the other common questions that go under it, like, do I need to submit test scores for the school? How many letters of recommendation do I need? How do they want an unweighted or weighted GPA? How much do extracurriculars count, right? All of those types of questions that you're probably asking go to answer this question. And it's an important question. And chances are, if you're working with your guidance counselor, you're probably getting like the list of schools, like your reaches and your targets and your safeties. Well, the reason that those schools are broken down in those categories is all based on answering this question, right? A reach school is that your chances of getting in aren't that good. Target is better, and of course the safety is like a slam dunk. But if money matters to you and your family, okay, and you're not willing to pay the $79,606 that more than half the freshman class paid at BU, Boston University last year, then you have to ask a different question. And the right question to actually ask is this: what colleges will offer you the most aid? It's a totally different question because, quite frankly, let me just kind of level set everybody. There are over 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. So even if you barely pass high school, right, you got D- or whatever your grading system is on every single one of your classes, and you barely eke by and graduate, and you still wanted to go to college, guess what? You can still go somewhere. It might not be your first choice, but one school, at least more than one school out of the 4,000 plus, will accept you. So getting accepted somewhere isn't really the question. You will get accepted somewhere. But every school out of those 4,000 is going to view you a little bit differently. And how they view you is going to drive how much money you're going to get, or none at all. All right. So so I'm not talking about like, well, what do I need for extracurriculars? We're not talking about that. This is a totally different ballgame. So the answer to the question of which schools will give you the most aid, it's this. As students and parents, we spend a lot of time, like building up our resume and making sure we're like the president of this club or the captain of this sport, and we're writing an awesome essay and everything else, and trying to make ourselves look good to the college. But you have to remember that the colleges, especially if you're a senior right now, you're probably getting inundated with mail, like postcards and letters, whatever. Hey, come apply to us or whatever, right? I know at our house, that's all we get these days, okay? Remember that colleges are trying to sell themselves to you. So the question of how, which schools would give you the most aid, it is not how much you want that college, right? Oh, I really wish I can get into this school, or I'm really hoping I did enough to get into that school. The answer is how much the school wants you. Period. That's it, right? You want the secret sauce of this? That's it. If they want you a lot, they'll give you a lot of money. And we'll talk about the factors. If they don't want you a lot, right, then they're not going to give you a lot of money. And and quite often actually doesn't have anything to do with grades. So let's talk about where money comes from. So a lot of times in these sessions, people ask like, well, what about the FAFSA? I got to get the FAFSA filled out. And this, yes, you have to fill out the FAFSA. And for you seniors, by the way, it doesn't open until October 1st. So you got a month, take a deep breath, you're okay, all right? But you got to figure out where the money comes from. And the FAFSA only controls the government, the federal government's money. And so a couple of years ago, this is how much the federal government gave out in aid. Over $142 billion, okay? But out of the $142 billion in college aid, $87 billion was in the form of loans. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to pay that back. But only $55 billion was in the form of grants or work study. Right? This is the money that you don't have to pay back. So that's the kind of aid that we like. So just kind of keep track of that 55 billion number for a second, because in reality, the majority of the aid money comes from the colleges themselves. So nationally, colleges that year gave out almost 69 billion, which is, by my math, 69 billion is a lot more than 55 billion, right? So the FAFSA doesn't control how the colleges give out their money. And the thing you have to remember is because it's their money, it's their rules. Right? Now, again, fill out the FAFSA, make sure you get it done because you don't want to leave money on the table, but you got to play this game for the colleges. So let's talk a little bit about merit scholarships. Right? This is what most of you probably think on the left. Like, in order to qualify for a scholarship, I have to have a really good GPA, right? Or I really need really good test scores, or I need a killer essay, or I need like these rock star recommendations, right? Or something like that. Or I need to be the captain of like 14 sports and, you know, the president of like another 14 clubs. Okay, yeah, that does help. But in reality, that's not actually what really matters. It's each college, right? I'm sure you guys have all heard about, oh, you need to be a well-rounded student. Like you got to do a little this and a little that and a little this other thing. Guess what? That's not actually true. Colleges want well-rounded student bodies. They'll pick the students. They want students who are, especially the really competitive, like, so we're talking Ivy, near Ivy League, they want students who are rock stars in like one thing. And so each college is always looking for these different criteria, right? Remember, colleges are businesses. So it's the number, I call it the number of boxes checked. So it could be based on academics, right? Merit scholarships can be based on GPA, SAT, whatever. That's true. But it can also be based on majors. So for example, right, if you're going to study engineering and you're going to go to MIT, right, which is one of the top engineering schools in the country, you don't really stand out, right? Because everybody and their dog who applies to MIT is an engineering major of some kind. You're average. Sorry to say it that way, but it's true. But on the other hand, there's colleges. So for example, Salem College or Salem University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they're ramping up their health sciences program, but they're not known for it right now, okay? They're not, and they're just getting started. But if you're a halfway decent student and you're willing to go to that college to be in a health sciences major, because the school is trying to build it up, you're probably going to get a ton of scholarship money because they're trying to attract kids to build up that program because they don't really have it right now. So there's that. Some schools look at geography, where you're from, right? That matters. Schools are constantly bouncing whether they want in-state or out-of-state. So for example, those of you who want to go to University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Michigan, any of the University of California schools, University of Washington, guess what? Or Texas, they don't need out-of-state students. So if you apply out-of-state to any of those schools that I just mentioned, you might still get in, but you're probably going to get zero for money. On the other hand, University of South Carolina, University of Alabama, University of Mississippi, here by me, University of Maine, loves out-of-state students. In fact, my stepdaughter, we've done the tour and stuff. If she gets into University of Maine, which she will, and she qualifies for their top level scholarship, which is a lot easier to get, it'll actually cost us less money to send her to University of Maine as an out-of-state student than it would be for us to send her to University of Massachusetts as an in-state student. So some of these public schools really love out-of-state kids, others don't. So it varies. It can also be based on gender, right? Like, so stereotypically, like engineering schools is predominantly male. Not saying that's fair or right, it just is what it is, right? So if you're a female going to an engineering school, you maybe get a little bit more money. If you're, or any sort of major where it's predominantly one gender versus the other. So if you're the opposite, then that matters too. And there's a host of other factors. So don't, so don't just stress about like, oh my goodness, my GPA is whatever, or my SAT is whatever. Yeah, it's important, obviously, but doesn't necessarily lead to scholarships or not, right? So you don't have to be a genius or have a perfect SAT score, ACT score for that matter, to get a scholarship. That's not the way it works. But let's take a look of how it really works. And here's a real life example. So for those of you who watched the Olympics that were on in Tokyo, if you think about any given event, thousands of people around the country around the world, I should say, tried to qualify for an event. Some of those people qualified for the Olympics and they got to go to Tokyo. But in every event, there's only 3 medals, right? Gold, silver, bronze. That's it. So using a specific example, 1500 meter freestyle women's, here's what the numbers are. Thousands of people try to qualify. 33 actually made it to Tokyo for that event, and there are 3 medals. You're wondering, Jack, that's great. Thanks for the lesson, but what on earth does this have to do with college application? Well, it actually works remarkably the same way. So imagine if you're Katie Ledecky, long distance US swimmer. She competed in 5 events in Tokyo. She got a 5th in one event, then 2 silvers and 2 golds. So think now if you were Katie Ledecky, if she was right, if you were her, and the different events she competed in were the different colleges. Well, one event she qualified, right? She applied to 5 schools. She got accepted by 5. But one of them, she wasn't really good enough to get a medal or scholarship, but the others were. So if you really kind of think about this, right, just to give you 2 extreme examples, by me, Boston College, right, 35,000 kids applied, right? That's like the number of people trying to qualify for the Olympics. 9,600 got admitted, right? They got to show up in Tokyo, if you will. Really 2,300 really enrolled. But how many kids out of the 2,300 actually got a merit scholarship at Boston College? 47 total, right? Total, 2% of the freshman class. So the running joke at Boston College is if you want a merit scholarship there, you better have cured cancer or you're out of the running, right? Now, conversely, another nice school, University of Tampa, 23,000 kids applied, 10,000 got accepted, 2,500 showed up, but over 2,000 kids got merit scholarship, or 81% of the freshman class, right? So if you're a really good student, if you're not really a good student, but whatever, but if you want to go to Tampa, your chances of getting merit scholarship are much easier at Tampa than they are at Boston College, right? And these things happen all over the country. In fact, a lot of schools don't even offer merit scholarships. Like most of the Ivy Leagues do not offer merit scholarships. So that's kind of the merit aid. Let me just quickly touch upon the need-based aid. So I'm not going to go into super detail on this because it can be quite complicated, but this is where you'll hear like, oh, you might hear your parents say, or some of you parents on the call, oh, we make too much money to qualify for aid. That might be true here. So schools use one of 2 formulas to calculate. They either use what's called the federal methodology, or FM for short, or the institutional methodology, which is, or IM for short. And how you tell the difference is what kind of financial aid form you need to submit. For a school that only needs the FAFSA, they use the federal methodology. For schools that require the FAFSA and what's called the CSS profile, they use the institutional methodology. I'm going to get into some differences in just a moment, but the big thing here, it is based on income and assets. So you might hear like, well, if I make a lot of money, I won't get aid. Yeah, that's kind of true. You might also hear, well, if I take all my money in my savings account and I bury it in my backyard, it'll get me more aid. That technically is true, but may not really matter. It is primarily income driven. So a lot of the things that you or your parents might see on the internet or hear about, like, oh yeah, if you hide this money here or hide that money there, it'll help you get a lot more aid. Yeah, technically it might be true, but that's really not what it's about. If your family made a ton of money, that's what it is. And the aid formulas are primarily income driven. So for those of you who are a little bit younger, something called the base year is known as the calendar year of spring or sophomore year to the fall of junior year. That's the income that is looked at for financial aid purposes. So just to give you a little bit around the timing. So for those of you who are high school seniors right now, you're about to fill out the financial aid form in fall of 2021. It is going to be based on the income of your parents' most recent tax return. And in the fall of 2021, your most recent tax return is for the tax return for year 2020. So for you high school seniors, if you think about what were you doing in 2020, well, in calendar year 2020, it was the spring of your sophomore year in high school through the summer to the fall of junior year. So for those of you who are younger, that's the year that you want your parents to look really poor on paper, right? You don't want to be poor, you just want to look poor on paper. For those of you who are past that, if you're already a high school senior, well, you can't go back, like you can't, your parents aren't going to go back and say, please unpay me. You have assets, which are accounts and stuff, and those values are as of the day you fill out the form. So there are still some strategies there. This is why, especially for those younger folks on the call, you got to start early. Not all is not lost, but there you go. I'm going to kind of skip some of this stuff. It's a little bit more a little bit more detailed, but I want to show you kind of how this all comes together. Right. So in the spring of your senior year, you're going to get notified by the colleges. Yes, you got into whatever college you applied to. And then they're going to send you what's called a financial aid award letter. And so this is a real one from one of my clients. This is actually from, what's the school? It's a school in New York. Oh, Malloy College. And it's really 2 pages. I apologize here. So this is page 1. This is what they got. And I'll just direct your attention to the lower right-hand corner, all those things, the scholarship, the Dominican scholarship and grant, $23,500. On the second page were all the federal things. So this student got some work study, which is a job on campus, and then some loans. Talk about that in just a moment. But loans isn't really aid because everybody qualifies for loans of some sort. So if you really add up where the money came from, well, this student got $6,500 in aid from the federal government, but $23,500 from the college itself. So earlier when I mentioned that the majority of the money comes from the college itself, this is what I'm talking about. This also then goes back to the types of schools you look at. How do you rank against the other applicants? Are you someone who just qualifies, meaning you'll get accepted, or are you going to be the gold medalist, right? Those things now matter. So let's talk a little bit about strategies. So something that for those students on the call and for parents, I encourage you to have a conversation, either parents have it with your student or students have with your parents, what I like to call the three numbers. First, you want to think about how much the college thinks you can afford. And this is a very easy number. This is something called the expected family contribution, or EFC for short. And there's tons of calculators online. You can just Google EFC calculator or have your parents do it. They put in their information and out spits a number. But that number is important to note because that's what the financial aid is based on, right? Not the scholarship aid, the financial aid. But then you want to figure out how much your family can actually afford. And then how much you're willing to afford. So I'll give you a real life example. Okay. Family I was working with several years ago here in the Boston area. Both mom and dad were big time earners. Okay. They made tons of money. So, and because remember, financial aid is primarily based on income, and this family's income was really high, their EFC, or that first number, how much the college thinks they can afford, was really, really high. So they were not going to get any need-based aid. Okay, fine. But how much could they actually afford? Well, I'm going to tell you right now that how much the family could actually afford was basically zero. So you might be thinking, well, wait a second, Jack, you just got done telling us that this family made big money. Why would how much they can actually afford be zero? Answer, because they spent their money like drunken sailors. All right. They spent it as fast as they came in. In fact, they had nothing in savings and they had a fair amount of credit card debt. So how much could they actually afford was zip. But how much were they willing to afford? Well, their son got into a fairly prestigious private school here in the Boston area. So he applied, right? He tried to qualify. He got in, he qualified, he was accepted, but he was not a medalist in any way. So he got zero scholarships. And his family did not qualify for any aid, which meant that this family was looking at a bill of over $75,000 a year to send their son to this particular school. But here's where that third number is important. The parents were willing to borrow these $75,000 a year it took to send their kid to the school. Your parents may or may not make that same decision. But you want to find out, because what ends up happening is inevitably you'll get into a school, and it'll be like your dream school or whatever, right? And again, you might have been good enough to get in, but you might not have been a medalist. So the school is going to cost whatever it's going to cost. And for some of you, you're going to get to go because your parents are willing to borrow the money. Good for you. Your parents aren't going to be too happy because they have to pay a lot in loans. But for others, your parents are going to say, you know what, sorry, this is just too much money. We can't send you. So even though you had your heart set on that school and you really wanted to go there and everything else, your parents are going to say, yes, sorry, kid, no. Right? So what I like to say is if you don't figure these things out, somebody is going to end up crying. It's either going to be you, the student, or it's going to be your parents, but somebody's going to end up crying if you don't figure this out. There are strategies depending on what those numbers are. I won't get into it now, but there are strategies to increase how much aid you can get, right? Need-based aid and things like that. I want to talk very, very briefly about loans because this is a common misconception. There's three basic types of loans. There's a federal direct loan that goes to you, the student. No cosigner, no credit check. You don't need to have a job, and payments don't start until you leave school. Notice I said leave school, I did not say graduate. Okay, so if you decide to leave school because something happened, you still got to pay the loan back. So that direct loan is to you, the student, but how much you can borrow is really, really small. The first year as a freshman, you can only borrow $5,500, and that's it. Sophomore year, $6,500. Then junior and senior years, $7,500 each year. So if you add up those numbers as an undergraduate, by yourself, you can only borrow a total of $27,000 across 4 years. So if you're looking at a school like University of Chicago at $81,000 a year, $5,000 helps, but doesn't really make that much of a dent. But that's all that you can do. And I emphasize that because I hear from so many parents and students think this way, like, well, my parents are willing to chip in $10,000, and anything above the $10,000, I got to do myself. Well, the only way to do is you either get like huge scholarships, because as an undergraduate, you cannot borrow that money, right? That direct loan, that is it, period. So if your parents say something like that to you, tell them, hey, mom, dad, or whatever, as great as that sounds, it's not realistic. So how do you get the rest of the money? Well, if your parents can use what's called the plus loan, which is the parent version of the direct loan, but it's to your parents. You're out of it. Or they can go with what's called a private loan, which is from like a bank or whatever. So the private loan is either to your parents or to you, the student, co-signed by the parents, right? Because we talked about as an 18-year-old high school senior, you're not gonna be able to borrow like $50,000, $70,000 a year. It doesn't happen, all right? Or if you have to borrow, your parents are gonna have to get involved. And if they're not willing to do that, well, then that's a different conversation, right? So this is why having the conversation about the three numbers, what what the school thinks you can afford, what you can actually afford, and what your parents are willing to afford. This is what I'm talking about. Now, earlier I said, if you plan this out, it also impacts what types of schools you should look at. That's kind of this, right? So we've talked a little bit about this already. So if your parents make so much money that you're not going to qualify for need-based aid, but they're not willing to pay 80 grand a year to send you to college, then you're looking at colleges that that give out a lot of merit aid and where you are going to be a medalist. Okay? Remember, colleges don't look at you for you. They look at you in comparison to all of the other applications they get. So I don't care if you have the perfect 4.0 out of 4.0 or you have a 1590 for SAT. That's awesome, great work. But at a school like MIT or Harvard, that makes you average, right? Sorry, but true, right? So if you're not going to get high, need-based aid, great. Then you're looking for a school that gives out a ton of merit. If you come from a divorced family, then you might want to only apply to a FAFSA-only school because of the way the financial aid works. Because profile schools or the institutional schools that require the FAFSA and the profile form, they count all of your parents. So for example, in my particular case, right? So my stepdaughter, so I'm remarried, okay, to my wife, her mother. So if my stepdaughter applied to a profile school, it would be her mother's income because she lives, the kid lives with us. But it'd be my income because I'm married to her mother. And it would be her father's income as what's called the non-custodial parent. So now you have three incomes you got to factor in. So if we had any kind of shot at getting aid before, well, I got blown out of the water in that case. Right? But you have other scenarios. So for example, if you want to go out of state, okay, you got to find the public schools that actually want out-of-state students. So in other words, not University of California, not University of Oregon, not University of Washington, not University of Michigan, not University of Virginia, not University of Texas, not University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Oh, and by the way, the Florida schools don't need you either, unless you live in Florida, right? But on the other hand, if you come from like a really low-income family, then you want schools that give out a ton of aid. And by the way, that's not every school, right? So now, depending on your situation, it might adjust what schools you even apply to. And so if you now go back to what I said in the beginning, remember, how do you get the most aid? It's not the school that you want, it's the school that wants you. And part of this, what you're seeing on the screen, is is playing the percentages to find the school that wants you. Totally different way to think about it. I understand that. And what I'm telling you, I understand is completely opposite than what you might hear from your parents or your guidance counselor. I get it. I know we're going to go to the Q&A section. I'm going to give you one quick tip about the pandemic. All right. So many schools went test optional. Kids couldn't get to visit the colleges. I understand, right? We were in shutdown. But as a result, the schools that have the national brand names, Harvard, NYU, MIT, University of Pennsylvania, University of North Carolina, right? Your state flagships, right? Stanford, Northwestern, Berkeley, right? All the names that everybody knows, no matter what part of the country you're from, those schools were inundated with applications. University of California, Irvine, a state school, basically a public Ivy, they took over 100,000 applications for 10,000 acceptances. And so all these schools, as a result of the pandemic, took so many more applications, which means it's not that you can't get in, but it made it harder to stand out. Remember, you're not looking to just qualify, you're looking to medal. And so if you're going up against 100,000 applications at UC Irvine, it's really hard to do. But what that also meant is that 80% to 85% of the colleges out there in the country, smaller private schools that you might be familiar with in your area, but maybe not everyone's heard of it if they're from another part of the country. Those schools were struggling for applications. They were begging kids to apply. And because they were struggling with applications, that's where kids were getting huge scholarships to go. Part of the search process, right? So if you got to think about this, so if every school on your list is like an Ivy League or a top tier school or whatever, that's great, right? Good luck to you, that's fine. But I wouldn't count on a lot of money in terms of scholarship, right? We talked about this. So this is again, and basically you have to know the rules to win the game. By the way, one other tip, so many schools are test optional, but can I just tell you that even though schools are test optional for admissions, you want to take a test anyway, SAT, ACT, I don't care, because 80%, almost all the schools around the country still use test scores for merit scholarship consideration. And in many cases, you might get in without a test score, but if you don't submit a test score, there is no scholarship, period. Okay, so if you don't have a score under your belt, get in for a test now. All right, that's part of knowing the rules. So here's my contact information. And again, I'm here to help. Right? Yes, this is what I do professionally, but I love doing this with InnovateX and our hosts here. So you have a question, just email me and I'll answer it. Okay, just plain simple. All right, so I'll leave that up. So with that, I know it was a couple of minutes over into our Q&A time. So Vivian, Daniel, and our hosts, I think Sophia's on and a couple others, why don't we take a look at some of the questions and I'll be happy to answer.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really helpful. Just a quick initial question. Will these slides be available after the session?
Yes, I can make them available, but my understanding is that this session got recorded as well, right? So what I would say is that if you really want the slides, what you really want to do is just talk to our host at InnovateX and just watch the recording, because sometimes it's not obvious of what the slides are saying if you don't have the context of what I'm talking about.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll be first going over our questions that we've received on the RSVP form, and then we'll be going into the questions in the Zoom chat. So our first question from the form is, what is something students often neglect about filling out financial aid forms?
Yeah. There are, if you listen to people who've done it, people will say that the financial aid form is really fast and simple. It's relatively straightforward. Yeah, I suppose that's true if you know what you're doing. I wouldn't say that people are neglectful, but there are still a lot of questions that are really kind of confusing, that may seem obvious, but really aren't. And I'm going to tell you right now, the directions don't help. And by the way, just to give you an idea of how long the forms are, if you are fully prepared, like if you know in advance what you need to fill out the FAFSA, you can be done in about 20 minutes if you're fully prepared ahead of time. The CSS profile form I like to call as a giant death trap. Okay, because even if you're fully prepared to do the CSS profile form, is a minimum of 2 hours. I do this professionally, so I help clients do this. I get my clients fully prepared. It's still 2 hours. And the questions on there are just landmines, just all over the place. So again, it may seem obvious, it's really not. So I wouldn't say neglect, it's just there's a lot of places for mistakes. Okay. Oh, all right, another question?
Okay. What are some common scholarships that people apply for or receive?
Okay, so what we've been talking about is what's called institutional scholarships, or scholarships that come from the colleges themselves. Colleges also have what's called endowed scholarships, so like a rich alumni donates a bunch of money, says, hey, I'll give a scholarship to kids who are left-handed, whose names are Jack, and they major in whatever, right? The colleges administer those, and sometimes you need extra applications, sometimes you don't. But your question, what you just asked, commonly points to what's called an outside scholarship. Outside scholarships are those given away by like local businesses, local foundations, things like that in your area. You can typically find those if you check with your guidance counselor. Usually they'll have lists. So if your high school uses a software like Naviance or Squire or something like that, usually they'll have it in there for all the local scholarships. Nationally, there are websites like fastwebscholarships.com, niche.com that also have scholarship search engines where you can search nationally for scholarships. I'm going to tell you right now, yes, there are those stories like, hey, I paid for all of my college student scholarships. Yes, it can be done, but it is a lot of work. It's a pure numbers game. You just got to crank out scholarship after scholarship after scholarship. The reality is most students don't do that. So I wouldn't, unless you're really willing to sit down and just do the search and just crank these things out one after the other, the reality is these outside scholarships provide a tiny, tiny sliver of aid because most people don't spend the time to apply for them. So I would focus on the school ones, right? Which gets back to everything we've been talking about.
Our next question is, do you have any tips on avoiding being in debt, or at least to avoid being in so much of it?
Yeah, so to avoid debt, right? So debt only comes from you spending the money and not having it first, right? So if you're going to go to an $80,000 a year college, you didn't get any need-based aid, and you didn't get any scholarships, and you didn't save for the money, you're going into debt, right? I mean, that's where it comes from. So the more things that you do that we've talked about, right, that's going to lower the cost of college. If you lower the cost of college, then automatically there's less debt. You also have to remember all these stories in the news about, oh, yeah, I graduated $200,000 in debt, whatever. Yeah, but a lot of that is really parent debt or cosign debt. Because remember, that direct loan, after 4 years, is only a maximum of $27,000. So having a lot of debt out of college really doesn't come from undergraduate years. Really, all those stories in the news about, oh, I graduated with so much debt, I can't afford to live, that really comes from graduate school, because the debt structure in graduate school is totally different. So if you meet someone who says, oh yeah, $400,000 of debt, it's because they went to graduate school. It's very hard to hit that kind of number just from undergraduate. So just kind of understand that with a grain of salt. Okay.
All right, got it. Here's another question. If I apply early decision to a school, is it possible that the financial aid package is more than it would be if we apply regular decision?
Great question. So there's a lot of myths out there. People say, well, you should apply early decision or early action because you get more aid. That is false. What is true is that if you apply early, there is more money available. True, but that doesn't mean you get it, right? If you apply early decision and you're the first application the college looks at, and they haven't looked at anybody else's, so by definition, they haven't handed out any scholarship money, is there more money available? Yes. But if you're not in the middle spot, you're still not getting any. All right, so just because it's there doesn't mean it's coming to you. Now, however, if you apply regular, now the reality is most kids who apply early decision or early action tend to get the majority of the scholarship money, because the kids who apply in those rounds tend to have the scores that would put them into that middle spot, right? Regular decision, the percentages tend to be lower. That is true, because regular decision tends to be those like, well, gee, I'm not really sure if I would make it into the school, you know, and a lot of the money is gone. So from that end of it, do you generally get less applying regular decision? Yeah, generally. But that doesn't mean automatically that if you apply early, you get more money. Common myth.
Our next question is, what do you know about financial aid and scholarships for international students?
Yes, international students. So if you're an international student coming to, so I'm going to assume that's international students coming to study in the US. I'm going to tell you right now, if you are here, you know, on a student visa or whatever, you are eligible to fill out the FAFSA and access some of the aid. The rules basically are the same as what I've talked about, except it's a little bit harder, because I'm going to be honest with you. Colleges love international students, because if your family in whatever country can afford to send you to the States to go to college, colleges know that, and more often than not, they're going to charge you full sticker price with no aid. Colleges kind of count on international students paying that $79,000 whatever we saw for BU, because that's a real moneymaker for colleges. On the other hand, if you're a US student looking to go overseas, generally the rules apply in terms of aid and loans. The US Department of Education maintains a list of certified schools that are, you know, international schools that are certified in the US financial aid system. So like a lot of schools in Canada, for example. So if that, and there's a list out there you can download. So if that international school in Canada is part of the US financial aid system, you still fill out the FAFSA. You can still get the direct loans like we talked about, but then obviously be up to the college as to whether or not you get any more aid like scholarships and stuff. And again, that's conceptually is really no different than if you just went to college in the US.
It sounds cool. We have a question from the chat. What is the mechanism to get the aid from the school? Do schools have applications you have to fill out? You just wait to see if they send you a financial letter after the acceptance letter?
Yep. So to have a shot at financial aid at school, you do need to fill out the financial aid form, whether it's FAFSA only or FAFSA and profile, depending on the school, you want to make sure you hit the deadline. So as people go through this process, people all understand, oh, my application for admissions is due on this date. But very rarely do people bother to look up the financial aid deadline. And for law schools, it's actually different. So your admissions application might be due November 1st, but the financial aid application may not be due until like March 1st, right? So you give yourself more time to prepare, that's okay. Other cases, they are the same. So understand what the deadlines are and then fill out the right forms. And be prepared. So generally speaking, the FAFSA site will tell you what you need in advance. I think it does a terrible job getting you prepared, but it will tell you generally what you need in advance. The CSS profile site, which is the College Board site, also tells you kind of what you need in advance. Again, I think they do a terrible job of it. But so like, don't just like sit down, log in, like, okay, I'm ready to do it. Like, spend some time figuring this out, right? But you do need to fill out the financial aid forms in order to get aid. By the way, one other point. It is an unwritten rule, but true at many, many schools, that if you do not fill out a financial aid form, you will not get a merit scholarship no matter what your scores say. Ithaca College finally took it off their website this past year, but for all these years prior, it said so on their website. No financial aid form, no merit scholarship, period. So if your parents or whatever, like, oh, this is too complicated, I don't want to fill it out, you're going to get good enough to be against merit scholarship anyway, you might be giving up that money if you don't fill out something.
Our next question is, how would you find schools that might recruit students with special needs?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So this all goes into the search. So of course, you can, the place to start would be like with the guidance counselor or like a private admissions counselor. There's plenty of those. You can certainly do Google searches, right? Schools that really, so you don't really put in like schools that look for special ed kids, right? It's really not quite like that. But the Google search might be something like schools that have really strong like student services programs or student support programs is kind of the indicator. In those types of situations, you can Google it, you get a list, but then it comes down to literally like visiting schools or going on the virtual tours or virtual info sessions and asking the right questions. Right, so this is true for everybody. If you think about if you've ever gone on a campus tour info session, right? What do people ask? Hey, do I need to submit test scores? Hey, how many letters of recommendation do I need? Right, like it's a pretty common question, right? But if money matters, the question you're asking is, hey, do you need to submit test scores in order to qualify for a merit scholarship? Or do you need to do something else? And people ask, well, what's the average GPA of a kid who got in last year? I don't want to know that. What I want to know is what the average GPA of a kid who got a merit scholarship last year. That's what I want to know, right? Because that can be a very different number. So same thing here when it gets to sort of special ed type situations is you want to find out like, so how does the school handle that? What services are available? What kind of accommodations are available? What, do they adjust the scores? Do they not adjust the scores? Right? Things like that. So these are all questions that quite honestly are not asked very often, but really should be asked when you're going through this.
Okay, we have one more question before we wrap up. So do scholarships roll over if you defer a year?
Great question. Not necessarily. So as a result of the pandemic, right, many more kids ended up deferring their admissions, understandably so. So again, this goes back to asking the right question. So one question that parents will ask or kids will ask is, if I choose to take a gap year, can I defer my admissions? And most colleges would say yes. Again, I don't want to know that. What I want to know is, hey, if I defer admissions for a year, do I get to keep the scholarship? that is not always a yes. In fact, quite often the answer to that is no, which is unfortunate because because then they'll reevaluate you. Are you going to be a gold medalist against next year's application pool? You might be, you might not be. Now you're kind of taking that chance. So again, ask the right questions, right? So, and so again, this is why what I'm telling you probably flies in the face of what you're hearing from guidance counselors and other parents and students. If you really want to save money, you're taking these tips I'm giving you.
All right, I think out of respect to everyone's time, we are going to wrap up since it is 9 o'clock. I know that not everyone who asked a question were able to have their question answered, so you can feel free to shoot Jack an email if you have any further questions. So we wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight and, you know, taking the time to spend the night with us here at InnovateX. Huge thank you to our guest speaker, Jack Wang. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and have a nice night.
And I'll just throw out thank you so much to InnovateX, our host. And again, for those of you who did not get your questions answered, or if you have additional questions, please just email me and I'll answer it.
Mhm. Awesome. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.